Hey guys, Matt back here with another Bikes and Beer teachable moment. On an earlier video, we talked about all of the kind of gaskets and seals in the transmission area that sometimes leak oil. And we said that depending on where your oil leak was and how severe it was, it could point to an underlying issue, a bigger problem with the engine or the transmission. So we're going to try and explore some of those bigger problems in a little bit of detail today so that you can understand why you would want to bring your bike for service when you see it leaking oil from particular areas in the transmission. Okay, so let's talk first about a transmission. This is your transmission. This is called your trapdoor, and basically your trapdoor has these two bearings in it and two nuts. And those two nuts basically hold your main shaft and your counter shaft in place. And all of this crap bolts in right here on the right-hand side of the engine. And then this big long shaft, the main shaft, comes out the left-hand side of the engine here. That's this main shaft. This one right here that we have in a vice stand, you can see that main shaft here. So now we take the transmission, we say, okay, the transmission is like a cartridge. It slides in like this. On one side, you have the nuts and the bearings and the trapdoor. And this is actually where your shift release is when you pull the clutch lever on a big twin. And then here on the side over here is basically where all the drive action happens. This is where you have a pulley right here going to the back of the bike. And this is where the clutch hangs. Notice, there is a lot of real estate here. This is a very long shaft. And way out here at the very end is where this giant heavy clutch and where all of the force of the chain drive in the primary from the engine spinning the clutch and transmission and the rear of the bike, all of that force is here on the very end of this shaft, which means that the bearings in the transmission, but particularly the bearing that goes around this main drive gear and the bearings inside there, and if we lift this clutch assembly off, you'll see there's a carrier bearing in this inner primary chain case. These bearings take a beating because there's so much force coming from the engine going back here and being transferred through the shaft with a whole bunch of weight on the end. So these are things that do wear out, do require maintenance, and if you don't do it, you're going to find yourself stranded on the side of the road or with a bigger problem. Just looking back at the transmission again, you can see the transmission, the gears are stacked. I'm not going to take these off because it can get pretty messy pretty quickly, but inside these gears, in between them, are bearings that they roll on in a nylon cage. And then there are these little spacers, and the little spacers have these half-moon shaped kind of shims or brackets that lock them into place. So it looks like that. You can see how the half-moon shaped pieces fit right in there. And then of course you have these shift forks, and the shift forks go here and here on the counter shaft and down here on the main shaft. And basically what they do is they align the gears. As you click on your shift lever, the shift forks move up and down like this, and they align these gears in a different pattern to give you a different speed. So we'll take all this stuff and we'll put that aside. Now we're looking at the transmission as a whole. You can see your shift forks in place, and you can imagine that you shift on your lever, it turns this shift drum, and this shift drum has grooves in it that make the forks move up and down, up and down. And depending on how these gears line up, you get a different speed coming out this main shaft. So, where do we have problems? Believe it or not, we usually don't have problems in the trapdoor bearings. Those are usually pretty robust because they're not really carrying a huge amount of weight. And we usually don't have problems in the bearings inside the gears. When we rebuild a transmission, we always rebuild all the internal bearings in here, replace them, just because we're in there and it's a good practice. But usually those bearings don't go bad inside here. There's another bearing here for the shift drum, but these things are not problem areas. The real problem area is this guy right here, this main drive gear. And the reason is the main drive gear sits right here, and it takes all of the force and all of the weight. This weighs Oh, this weighs a good 5 or 6 kilo, if not more, maybe 8 kilo, okay? So you've got 8 kilo of weight hanging off the end of this, and then you're putting, depending on the motor, somewhere between 75 and maybe 120 or 150 or more Newton meters of twist through here. And that's a lot of force going onto this gear and this bearing, this bearing that holds the gear in place, okay? So this bearing really takes a beating. And to show you how bad they get, I've got this one here, and you can see that's, hold on a second. Let's try and wiggle this for you. See that? That's a lot of wiggle. You don't want that much wiggle when you're trying to transfer power. So what happens? Also, you can see it's corroded inside. So what happens when this wiggles? Well, this is the main drive gear that bearing came off of. You can see the matching corrosion there. Inside, there are supposed to be bearings. And these bearings are actually very small needle bearings. They look like this. They're just very, very small bearings. And the only purpose for those bearings is for this output shaft to be able to spin inside the main gear without causing a problem, without causing friction. So those bearings are not meant to carry weight. They're meant to allow this main shaft to spin inside the main drive gear. Now the problem comes when this main drive gear bearing gets all wobbly and bad, when this gets all crappy and wobbly and bad, then all of a sudden, this thing is not the thing that's carrying the force. All of a sudden, the force is being transferred to these little teeny tiny bearings that sit inside here, like that. And what you end up with is what you see here. This bearing actually disintegrated. You can see these are all the rollers, and that's the cage. It basically just fell apart, and it caused some problems. Also, notice this race, the outer part of the bearing. You see that big white streak? That white streak is from all of the heat that was being generated, and you can also see the same white streak inside this main drive gear because that bearing was sitting on the outside of the main drive gear, and instead of this big honkin' bearing carrying all of the force of the transmission and the clutch and the primary, this bearing had gone so bad that all of that force was being carried by these tiny little roller bearings, and they actually almost welded this bearing into place inside this main drive gear. It took a lot of force to get this thing out because so much heat was being generated because these poor little bearings were carrying all the weight of the torque and the force and the pressure coming through the transmission from the clutch, from the primary. So this bearing, this main drive bearing, is extremely important. What happens if that main drive bearing goes bad? Well, number one, it causes damage to your main drive gear and, of course, your main drive gear bearings. But the other thing it does is because this bearing is not then keeping the transmission shaft completely level, it allows the transmission shaft to tilt a little. And when that transmission shaft tilts, if we look inside this clutch assembly, you see the hub is in the center. The outer part is the clutch basket. You can see it's got fingers here, and then pressed into the center is a bearing. Basically, it sits behind this circlip, and pressed up through the bearing is this clutch hub, right? And this is what holds the inside of your clutch discs. Look at this clutch hub. See all those teeth are all wiped out? Those teeth are the teeth that go onto these splines. It matches up like that. These teeth are wiped out because this clutch hub was actually pivoting because it could pivot because this shaft was not parallel. It was moving so much because it only had these tiny bearings supporting it. So this clutch hub started to pivot, and what it allowed to do, can you see this witness mark on the inner primary chain case? That is from the chain ring, the actual starter gear ring here, spinning and rubbing against the inner primary chain case because these teeth had worn off, and it was allowing the whole clutch assembly to tilt, and that was all happening because this main drive gear bearing was bad. You can also see this kind of damage and this kind of damage if you have a bad compensator, but the telltale, if it's a compensator, is when you turn the bike off, you'll often hear a clank, clank, clank from the compensator rattling, or sometimes when you go to start the bike, you'll start it and it will go, the starter will be kind of weak, and then it'll make a ka-kang, and it won't start, okay? That will tell you often that your compensator is bad. But the typical case here is that you have a main drive gear bearing that goes bad. This main drive gear, the inner bearings start to take all of the force of this big main shaft, and then all of that gets transferred into the clutch hub and allows the clutch hub to tilt and strip its splines. And then of course you have a clutch hub bearing in here. And then in between, you have this carrier bearing, which runs through the primary chain case. And this bearing basically has a race that rides through it. That race essentially sits like this. And there is a seal behind that race to keep oil from leaking. But basically, this is your orientation. You have your transmission. You have all of the different bearing components inside. But most of those bearing components don't really usually have a problem unless you're really beating the transmission up, okay, power shifting and such. Most of all the problems you're going to have that you're going to see issues with are going to be your main drive gear bearing and the inner bearings that go with the main drive gear if this one fails, and the result of damage to the clutch hub and clutch bearing and possibly to this primary chain case bearing that happens when this shaft is no longer perpendicular and perfectly straight because it can move so much because this bearing goes bad and this whole thing can wobble. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an explanation of what the underlying issues are that are indicated by an oil leak in your transmission or primary area, and why it's really important if you start to see an oil leak or hear some weird noises, or you're doing, an oil change on your bike, or you take off the primary cover and you see a scrape here. That's kind of uh-oh time. And that's when you want to come see us at Bikes and Beer, or whoever your reputable service garage is, and you want to make sure that somebody gets in here, checks it out, and fixes the problem before it becomes worse. So teachable moment, again, from Bikes and Beer Garage. Hopefully we drop some knowledge on you. We're always happy to work on your bike, happy to hear from you, happy to talk to you. Come see us anytime you want. Bikes and Beer Garage. Get some.